Welcome back to VMware View 5 Essentials Training. In this lesson, we're going to discuss user profiles and user data and how you can manage them in a View environment. So to cover the user profile, we'll first talk about what the user profile is, why it's valuable in a View environment, and what makes up a user profile. Then we'll talk about some of the options you have for managing the user profile. We'll then dive into one specific option, which is the View Persona Management, that is a new feature with View 5. I'll cover how to manage it and the different settings you have to configure it. We'll also talk about another option, which is the persistent disk that View offers. And we'll also talk about the disposable disk, which helps with managing the size of our linked clones. Then we'll talk about the user data and how we can manage it using folder redirection. And I'll finish up with some demonstrations of these topics. So let's start with the value of the user profile and why it's so important for us to deal with in a View environment. First and foremost, it maintains the user state and any customizations that they make, not only on a single desktop on a single session, but across multiple desktops if you're using a floating pool. The user profile has been around a lot longer than VDI has been, so it's kind of dumb about how to be managed across multiple Windows sessions. By default, it only exists on the local hard drive, and depending on your operating system, it'll either be in the C Documents and Settings directory or in the C Users directory. When a user first logs into a brand new desktop, it'll create a profile for that user, copying the default user profile. This creates all the basic settings that the user needs. You can manipulate the default user profile in order to set settings that you want every user to have. The challenge we have in a View environment is that we want this user profile to exist outside of a desktop, so we can throw the desktop away after the user's done, but still maintain all of their settings to the next session. We do that by storing the profile out on the network drive. That's the challenge we have with any VDI environment. How do we copy that user profile back and forth to the network in order to enhance that user experience? Before we dig into that, let's take a look at what the user profile actually contains. First of all, it has the user documents directory. This includes my documents, my pictures, my music, and all those others. This is the primary location of the user data. The app data directory contains application data that's unique for each user. This can be very important for application customizations. The desktop icons and placement on the desktop, as well as the desktop wallpaper, are all contained in the user profile. The theme the user chooses for their windows, the toolbar configuration, their custom dictionary, and any custom words that they've entered into it. All the applications they've determined that they want to start up as soon as they log in. The recent documents list, and many different control panel settings are stored at a per user level. And finally, and most importantly, is the ntuser.dat, which contains some of these settings, and any registry settings in the current user hive for that particular user. These are all the items we want to roam from one session to the next in order to give the user the best user experience. So, what are our options for managing this user profile? Well, you could just use the default user profile for every login. This means that each user will be a brand new user every time they log in, and they'll have to go through the copy of the default user profile. This may be acceptable in situations where you don't know who will log in, for example on a very public machine, where anybody could log in at any time. Mandatory profile is a profile we can define out in Active Directory that'll copy down for every user. It's a read-only copy of a profile, but it is a pre-customized and ready-to-go profile. This is good in a situation like a call center, where we want everyone to have a consistent experience, but they don't have to be customized to the individual users. Active Directory roaming profile has been an option in Active Directory for quite a while. It provides the ability to define within Active Directory where a user's profile is stored, and automates the process of copying the profile every time the user logs in and off. Traditionally, this has been the main option for a user's profile to be copied from one session to the next, and from one computer to the next. But it has a reputation of being prone to error and corruption of the profile, which is why several third-party options have been created, such as View Persona Management. This is a new feature for View 5, but we'll look at it in a little bit more depth in the following slides. The View Persistent Disk is another option that View gives us. It has more limitations than the View Persona Management, but we'll discuss this one in later slides as well. And finally, there are many third-party utilities out on the market today that can be used to manage a user's profile and data. Many of these tools offer other features other than just the profile piece of it. I highly recommend investigating some of these third-party utilities because the options they provide are oftentimes a greater feature set than what Active Directory or View will provide. So let's talk specifically about View Persona Management. Its major limitation is that it's only available for View virtual desktops. So if you want to be able to roam physical desktops as well, you'll have to find another solution for those. It does store the user's profiles in the native Windows profile format, so it's easy to copy them back and forth without having to do any sort of translation. There are many tricks that the View and third-party profile management tools do to help speed up and increase the reliability of the profile copying. One of the tricks that View Persona Management uses is that it only copies critical files during the login process. This speeds up the login process dramatically. By default, it's going to copy all the registry settings and the startup folder, because those are the pieces that are needed immediately on logon. You can identify additional directories that can be copied during the login process or immediately after the login process to help speed up application and document performance after the user's already logged in. All other files are copied down to the desktop when they're accessed. So if I have a Word document I only access once a month, that file won't be copied down every time. It'll stay out on the network until I need it, and when I double click on it, it'll then copy it down. In the UI of Windows, it always looks like it's there, but in the background it will only copy it down when I access it. If a user makes any changes to any files that are covered by View Persona Management, those changes are copied on a regular basis. By default, it's every 10 minutes it does a synchronization, but you do have the capability of modifying that sync time. This is another one of the tricks that View Persona Management will play, and has the major advantage of making sure that your user's profiles are as up to date as possible. Think of it as a regular backup for your user's desktop experience. When the user logs off, only the files that have been modified during that session will be copied back up to the file server. And more importantly, only the files that have been modified since the last sync. This helps to greatly increase the speed in which the log-off process occurs. Overall, the major advantage of the View Persona Management is that it is a much faster login and log-off process than Active Directory roaming profiles. This is due to the fact that it's only copying files that it needs to, and not the entire profile, which is what leads to a lot of corruption issues when using Active Directory roaming profiles. Now, Persona Management can work with Active Directory roaming profiles. This is particularly useful when you want the user to be able to roam between physical desktops and your View infrastructure. But you must be careful with how your users log in, because they can stomp on each other if both Active Directory roaming profiles and View Persona Management are trying to update the same network path. So let's talk about how you can set up Persona Management. The installation of Persona Management is relatively easy. It's just another option within the View agent to install. It's then managed via group policy. You use an ADM template provided on the View connection server once it's installed. You simply need to load this ADM template up into a GPO that's either applied at the Active Directory level or even as a local group policy. The settings in the ADM template are part of the computer configuration section, so the GPO should be applied directly to the virtual desktops, not to the users themselves. When using Windows XP as your parent image for your desktops, VMware recommends using the User Profile Hive Cleanup utility that Microsoft provides. This ensures that during logoff, the user's profile is cleanly copied back up to the network and is then completely closed out on the desktop. This helps to avoid corruption issues that can occur to the user's profile when copying back and forth onto the network. So let's quickly go through some of the settings that are available for View Persona Management. First of all, you have the option to turn it on or off. Once it's turned on, you can then set the synchronization interval that we talked about before. By default, this is 10 minutes, and can be set to any interval of minutes. You then define the Persona repository location. If you enable Persona Management, but don't define a Persona repository location, View will go into the user account and look at the Active Directory roaming profile path that may be set there, and use that as the location. This is where we would want it to save the profile if we want the user to be able to roam back and forth between physical and virtual desktops. But if we don't want that, we definitely want to specify an alternative UNC path, so we don't have to worry about the Active Directory roaming profile and the Persona Management profile from stomping on each other. In that case, we want to explicitly check the Override Active Directory User Profile path if it is configured option, so that it will force it out to this UNC path. We also have the option to remove the local persona on logoff. this will delete the profile that exists on that desktop during the logoff process. The advantage of this is to clean up the user profile on desktops that aren't refreshed every time the user logs off, in order to keep that desktop image nice and clean. Now it does increase the logoff time because it's got an additional step it's got to perform. And you can also choose not to delete the local settings for that user, which could be useful in some specific use cases, where you may want the user's profile to disappear, but them to still have their local settings available if they were to log back into that desktop. We can choose whether or not to roam the local settings as well. The local settings are in the local settings directory or the appdata/local directory, depending on your operating system version. This could be useful for those applications that store their data about that user specifically in the appdata directory, instead of the user's profile directly. This creates consistency not only with Windows, but also with applications, as users log in from one desktop to the next. The Files and Folders to Preload setting allows us to define a list of files and folders that we want to be downloaded during the login process. As I stated before, the startup folder is always preloaded, and you can't disable that. But there may be other directories that you know the users are going to use every single day and want to have quickest access to it. This will increase the login time, but will improve the application performance once the user does get logged in. All the paths for this setting and all the following settings that require a path should be entered as relative paths to the local profile itself. In a Windows 7 environment, it would be relative to the c:/users/username directory. The Files and Folders to Preload Exceptions setting allows us to identify paths and files that we do not want preloaded. So if there's something specifically within the startup folder, for example, that we don't want preloaded, we can identify it here. The Windows Roaming Profile Synchronization setting allows us to define files and folders that will behave like standard Active Directory roaming profiles. In other words, they'll be downloaded only during logon and logoff. They won't be synced or downloaded on demand. There are some applications that may not work well with the synchronization and the background downloading features of View Persona Management. If you find any of those, this is the place to enter those directories. We also have an exception setting for the Windows Roaming Profile Synchronization. For files and folders within the folders that we defined on the previous setting that won't behave as if they were roaming profile folders. We can also explicitly define files and folders we don't want to roam at all. This can help to reduce the size of the profile and eliminate the stuff that we don't want copied out to the network, or that the user won't need from one session to the next. By default, the user profile's temp directory, the ThinApp cache folder, and cache folders for the different web browsers are automatically excluded from roaming. You can define exceptions within those settings that you do want to roam, even though their parent folder will not roam. We can also identify folders that we want to background download. These are files and folders that will download to the desktop after the login process is completed, but completely within the background. This allows users to go ahead and log in, start opening applications, but have no clue that files are actually downloading off the network in the background and preparing themselves for quick access. Once again, we can define exceptions to this rule if we have subdirectories or files that we don't want to download in the background. These files and folders in the profile that are stored out on the network and synchronized by View Persona Management will by default show a little icon that indicates that they are synchronized out on the network. We can choose to hide this icon by enabling the Hide Local Offline File icon setting. Disabling it will then show that icon. When a large file is being downloaded by View Persona Management, a little progress bar will show up, which lets the user know that they are waiting for a file to download off the network. This is useful because users need to know why their file isn't opening up immediately. We can also identify the minimum file size, which will prompt View to show the progress bar for the downloaded file. By default, this is set to 50 megabytes and can be adjusted based on your user's needs for information and the speed of your network. When a critical error occurs with the profile being synchronized or copied, you can configure View Persona Management to show the user directly that there is an error via a tray icon alert. By default, this is going to be disabled, so users won't know about any of these critical errors. If you want them to have this information, you'll have to go in and enable this setting. Those are the most important settings for View Persona Management. There are other settings out there, and we'll take a quick look at them during the demonstration portion. But those are the ones that most administrators will need to know about. Now let's talk about the persistent disk. The persistent disk works by redirecting the user's profile and data directories out onto a different VMDK disk. This gives us the unique capability of being able to detach this VMDK and reattach it to a different machine. Given the architecture of how persistent disks work, they're currently only available for dedicated pools, so users that are in floating pools cannot take advantage of a persistent disk. Now, the fact that it's a separate VMDK file means that it's not affected by composer operations. So during a recompose or refresh operation, Vue will actually detach the VMDK, perform whatever function it needs to do, and then reattach that persistent disk back into the VM. This gives you the ability to completely change the operating system with updates or additional application installs without affecting the user's profile. Once the user logs in, all their settings will still be in place, but whatever changes you made during the recompose operation will also be in place. You do have the ability to configure where the persistent disks are stored. They can either be stored with the virtual machine or in a specific data store. So one advantage persistent disk gives you is the ability to put them all into a single data store that can then be replicated to an offsite location. In a DR event, you won't have all of your desktops over on the new site, but you will have all the user profile information and user data, which is really the most important piece that we want to have backed up. You can also choose to detach the persistent disk from a linked clone. When you do that, you can choose which data store it is placed on, and then the desktop is immediately deleted afterwards. This could be useful during the termination process of an employee, so you can keep all their information from their profile and their data, but not keep the desktop itself. You can then later reattach this persistent disk to another linked clone. The main caveat on reattaching a persistent disk to a new linked clone is that the OS version must be the same as the original linked clone was. You can also import the persistent disks from vCenter. So in the case where you're replicating to a new site for DR purposes, and then you need to reattach the persistent disk to the linked clone over at the DR site, as long as you're an administrator within vCenter and Vue, you can browse through the vCenter inventory to find the persistent disk and import it into Vue Administrator, and then reattach it to the new linked clone. You can also recreate the desktop from the persistent disk. In that case, the desktop that it creates will be in the same pool that the persistent disk previously was a member of. Now let's talk about the disposable disk, which doesn't directly address the management of a user profile, but does have a huge impact on the sizing of the linked clone and the management of the user data. The disposable disk is used to store the Windows paging file and temp files on a secondary non-persistent VMDK. This works well because Vue can easily replace that disk with a completely clean copy, making it easy for Vue to wipe out those paging files and temp files that aren't necessary from one session to the next. It also helps to slow the growth of the linked clone disk, because you're not placing all those files onto the main C drive, which will bloat that linked clone. This has the dual advantage of reducing your amount of storage and increasing performance because you're not continually growing that linked clone disk. You want to make sure to size it larger than the maximum page file size and width in Windows. In this case, it makes a lot of sense to explicitly define the size of the paging file so that you can properly size the disposable disk as well. Now, the disposable disk will be stored on the same data store as the OS disk. Finally, let's talk about folder redirection and how we can manage the user's data from one session to the next. Any folders that are redirected out to the network appear like they're local, but will actually reside solely on the network share. They will not be copied to the local desktop like they are with Vue Persona Management. When you save the file, it saves directly out to the network share. This, of course, helps to reduce the size of the user profile and minimizes the amount of data that needs to be copied back and forth during the login and logoff processes, or during synchronization events. Now, Active Directory does provide us the capability to do folder redirection, and within a native Windows 2008 AD, we get 13 different folders that we can define. Vue Persona Management provides us 22 different folders that can be redirected. Many of the third-party profile management solutions also provide the capability to do folder redirection. VMware explicitly recommends relying on Persona Management's ability to copy the files back and forth on demand, rather than using folder redirection. This greatly simplifies the configuration of your users' profiles. Now let's take a dive into Vue Persona Management. Here in our domain controller, within the Active Directory Users and Computers tool, you can see we have our vDesktops OU, where we'll contain all of our virtual desktops. Under there is an OU called Persona Management, where we'll put the pools that we want to use Persona Management within. Here you can see we've got one desktop from accounting and one desktop from agents that are currently deployed within our View infrastructure. All the magic of View Persona Management occurs within GPOs. Here you'll see that we've already created a View Persona Management group policy and applied it to the Persona Management OU. Looking at the settings, you can see that no settings have been applied yet. So we've got a clean GPO here that we can modify. Let's go on in and edit this. All the settings for View Persona Management exist under the Computer Configuration container. So the first thing we're going to need to do is add the administrative template. So we'll right-click and select Add Remove Templates. We'll add the template, which is always going to be located on your View connection server. So we'll browse out to the View connection server. And it'll be located under the Program Files, VMware, VMware View, Server, Extras, Group Policy Files. And it's called viewpm.adm. So we'll open that and click Close here. Now you'll see there is a Classic Administrative Templates folder that has appeared. We'll expand that and look under the VMware View Agent Configuration, where we'll find Persona Management. Inside of Persona Management, we have options for setting roaming and synchronization settings, folder redirection, desktop UI, and logging configuration. We'll start in roaming and synchronization. We'll start by setting Manage User Persona, since this is the main configuration setting. By enabling this setting, we will enable the functionality of View Persona Management. So we'll go ahead and enable that here. We now have the option of setting what the upload interval is for the profile. By default, it's every 10 minutes. So if you want more frequent updates of the persona out onto the network, you can bump this down to a lower number. Alternatively, if bandwidth is a concern, you can bump the number up to reduce the number of times that it updates. We'll stick with the default here. Now let's work our way down through the different settings, starting with files and folders excluded from roaming. This setting will allow us to define directories that we do not want to be a part of our persona, and therefore won't be backed up to the network. By enabling this, we can click the Show button. We can now add values, which will be excluded from the profile. Let's say our users tend to put their personal data on their desktop in a folder called Personal Data. We don't want to back that up to the network, since everything we back up to the network will be taking space on our file server. So we can add the path to that personal data directory relative to the profile, and that folder will no longer be backed up as part of the profile. Now we can click OK, and we can move on to the next setting. Next is files and folders excluded from roaming exceptions. In here you can enter values that represent relative directory paths to the local profile. So for example, if the users have within that personal data directory another directory called evaluations, and we want to actually back up that data and keep it out on the network, we can simply enter this. View Persona Management will actually make this an exception to the exclusion, thereby including that directory but not its parent directory or any of its siblings. Next is the Files and Folders to Preload setting. Enabling this gives us the ability to click the Show button, and again enter a relative path to the root of the local profile. Directories entered here are directories that will be loaded during the login process of the user, so they'll already be staged on the virtual desktop and won't need to stream down on access. Our users consistently use a directory called Worksheets that exists on their desktop to store data. This data is used daily by many of our employees, so we don't want these users to have to wait for their documents to download each time they access them. By adding this Worksheets directory to our preload policy, we'll make sure that this directory is copied down during the login process. This will make the login process a bit longer, but access to the documents will be a lot quicker. Once again, we enter this directory as a relative path. Moving on to the next setting, we can identify exceptions to the preload directories that we just created. Similar to the previous exceptions that we set up, we would use a subdirectory of any of the preload directories that we identified in the previous setting. Next is the Folders to Background download. By enabling this setting, we can identify directories that will be downloaded in the background after the user's login process has completed. This is a good way to be able to get the documents downloaded onto the virtual desktop so that the user's application launch time is improved without hurting the logon process. Many of our users have a reports directory that they use on a regular basis, but not necessarily daily. So we'll go ahead and have those download in the background so that they're available to the users quickly when they need them. The next setting is exceptions to the background download. So if there is a subdirectory of the reports directory that we don't want it to actually download in the background, we can enter that directory within this particular setting. Next is the Manage User Persona, which we've already set. After that is the Persona Repository Location. Here we can define what UNC path is going to be used to dump the user's profiles out onto the network. Enabling this gives us the ability to enter share path. If we don't enter anything here, View will go into Active Directory and check for the user's account what the user profile path setting is, and use that same directory. This would be the same directory that's used during the usage of roaming profiles. We'll go ahead and enter an explicit path so we can better observe the differences between Active Directory roaming profiles and View Persona profiles. By default is the way things are set right now. If a user account had the user profile path defined within Active Directory, on their AD account, View would use that whether or not we had a share path defined. If we want View to explicitly use this path that we've defined here, regardless of what Active Directory has set, we can use this override Active Directory user profile path. So now anytime View is configured, it will always use this DC01 View profiles path. The Remove Local Persona at Logoff allows us to delete the local version of the profile, thereby cleaning up the user's profile on that desktop, preparing it for better use for the next user. This setting is really only useful when using a common desktop that multiple users would share, and that isn't being deleted or refreshed on logoff. Generally speaking, we're going to do one of those two operations on each desktop when the user logs off, so this setting won't gain us a whole lot. So we'll move on. In order to roam the local settings directory, where some applications will dump personalized information for the user, we need to enable the Roam Local Settings Folders setting. By enabling this, we'll increase the size of the profile, since we'll now be copying up and down the local settings directory or app data local directory, depending on which operating system is in use. This will, however, ensure that we have all the files we need to properly launch the applications and give the user the same experience the last time they launched it. The Windows Roaming Profile Synchronization allows us to define directories that View Persona Management will hand over to Active Directory roaming profiles to manage. This results in the files only being copied down or backed up to the network on logon and logoff. In our scenario, we don't have any use cases for this, so we'll move on. Here we can define exceptions to the roaming profile synchronization setting. So those are all the settings that we have within the roaming and synchronization section. Let's move on to the folder redirection section. Here you can see the list of all the different directories that are part of the profile that can be redirected out to the network, rather than being contained in the profile. This has the advantage of reducing the size of the profile and providing users direct access to the files across the network, rather than having to wait for them to download the first time they try to access them. In most cases, VMware will recommend not to use these, and rely on the fact that the files the user needs will be downloaded when they access them. One common use for folder redirection is to redirect My Documents so it points to the same place that their home drive does. So we'll go ahead and configure that. We'll start by enabling the setting, and then tell it where we want to redirect it to. We'll redirect all the user's data to dco1/view user data, and underneath there create a My Documents. And now when the user double-clicks on My Documents, they'll actually be directly accessing a network share. Let's move on to the Desktop UI folder and look at our different settings. First of all, we can decide whether or not to hide the local offline file icons. The offline file icon is an icon that is used to identify when a file is actually resident on the network, whether or not it's been downloaded locally so that it can be taken offline. This tends to interrupt the user's experience with their desktop, and if they're always using a hosted desktop that will never leave the data center, there's no need to ever let them know that that file is not actually a local file. By default, this icon is hidden, but we want to make sure that it is always hidden and can't be overridden by something else, so we'll go ahead and enable it here. The next setting allows us to define whether or not users will be alerted when there are issues with the synchronization via a tray icon alert. The default value for this setting is to hide the alerts. We'll go ahead and explicitly define that as well. Finally, we get to decide if and when a progress bar is displayed when downloading large files. By enabling the setting, users will see a progress bar when a large file is being downloaded. How large a file is determined down here, where we can define the minimal file size in megabytes. So with this setting, any file size that is greater than 50 megabytes will show a progress bar to indicate its download progress. That looks good, so we'll go ahead and accept those settings. Finally, logging. We won't go through these individual settings, since VMware generally recommends you only enable logging when there is an issue. So until we see an issue, we'll leave these all with their default settings. Now that we've configured the configuration, let's take a look at the directory where we'll be storing all these files. They're located on the C drive of our domain controller, under the View Persona Management directory. There's a View Profiles and a View User Data directory, both of which are shared out on the network. We'll come back here to take a look at them as we have users log in and create the directories. But for now, let's switch over to our View client. But we'll have a user login. And we'll have Alan log in. Now, Alan is a member of our accounting pool, which exists within the View Persona Management OU. So we'll connect to that. Now, since Alan doesn't already have a profile defined, the default user profile is being copied to make one for him. Now that we have Alan logged in, let's make a few changes. First of all, since Alan is an accountant, he'll oftentimes use the calculator tool. So let's make a shortcut to his desktop. Let's also create a directory called personal data, which we'll use to demonstrate the exclusions we set in the group policy. We'll create a new file in here called report. We'll also create another folder in here called evaluations. This is the folder that we set as an exception to the rule that excludes a personal data directory from being copied. In here we'll create another Word document. Back on our desktop, let's create two more folders. One called Reports, and the other called Worksheets. Let's also change the color of his background. To this beautiful shade of green. Let's also go into My Documents. We'll delete these existing directories and create a new document. You can already see the synchronization icon that's appearing on this document. This is an indication that the file is actually stored out onto the network. Now that we've made these settings, let's go take a look at the folder in which these are stored out on the network. We want to look at these folders from within Alan's session so that we can look at them with Alan's permissions, because no other user account has access to Alan's folders out on the network. So here you can see in the Profiles directory, Alan.home, which represents Alan's profile. We'll go ahead and show the hidden files and folders, and choose not to hide the extensions. This allows us to see the full user profile, including the ntuser.dat, the desktop directory, and the application data, along with several others. Looking in the desktop, you can see our 2 shortcuts and 3 folders that have been created on Alan's desktop have all already been synced out. These are not folder redirects, but rather synchronization that happens in the background. For example, if we delete the Windows Media Player icon from his desktop, it is not automatically reflected out in the Profiles network directory. It'll take about a minute before it synchronizes, and we should see this icon disappear. While we wait for that, let's go back and look at the redirect folders in the View User Data directory. A My Documents directory is automatically created, under which you can see folders for each individual user. Within Alan's directory, we see the To-Dos document that we created. Now that synchronization has occurred, we can see that the shortcut to Windows Media Player is now gone. The accounting pool is a floating, non-persistent pool that gets refreshed on every logoff. As soon as we log off this machine, View should start to refresh this machine. If Alan logs in immediately after that, he'll likely get a different desktop, which would not have his local profile on it. Let's take a look and see which computer Alan is currently on. So Alan is on Accounting 01. So let's log off. Now back at the client desktop, we can open up the View client again. And we'll again connect with Alan. And connect to the accounting desktop. Now that we have Alan's desktop, we can see that the computer continues to show a green desktop, and all of our folders and our calculator shortcut still appear on the desktop, in the same position that we put them. Looking inside the personal data folder, you'll see that all of its contents did not come back down. This is an odd little quirk I've found with persona management. If we go take a look out on the file server, you'll see that those files did get copied out to the network. But only the evaluations folder got copied, because everything else is still excluded as part of the personal data folder. Since evaluations was configured as an exception to that rule, it was copied out. Let's also quickly look at Alan's documents, where you can see our to-dos document is still there. But we've also added a My Music and a My Pictures directory, which Windows automatically adds on every login. To verify that we're seeing a different computer, here you can see that we're now on Accounting 02 instead of Accounting 01. Accounting 02 has never seen Alan logged in before. So you can see that View Persona Management has maintained all the customizations that Alan has created from Accounting 01 and applied them to Accounting 02 and any other desktops he logs into that are covered by the View Persona feature. So that's a quick run through on View Persona Management. So now let's take a look at what our profile looks like when using a View Persistent disk. We're going to start off in View Administrator to show you the configuration of it, before we actually show you what it looks like. So looking here at our Agents pool, we're going to click the Edit button. We're on the General tab. We can see, down in the View Composer Disks section, we have a persistent disk configured with a size of 2 gigs and configured to mount up as the D drive. Now back on our client machine, we're going to log into View. Well, this time we're going to log in as Charles, who's a member of the Agents group. So we'll select the Agents desktop and click Connect. Now logged into the desktop, let's take a look at my computer, where we can see we have a D drive named Persistent Data Disk. On here we have a Documents and Settings directory that contains all the normal user profiles, including Charles's. Showing the hidden files and folders, we can see all the normal directories, including the desktop, the application data, and local settings. Now let's make a couple changes to Charles's desktop. First of all, let's change the color. I'll use this nice gray color. We'll add a shortcut to his email. Now let's log off Charles. Since the persistent disk looks like a local disk to the Windows operating system, and the fact that the Agents pool is a dedicated pool, Charles will always connect to the same desktop and will always have the local profile available to him. But what if something were to happen to the desktop that he's currently assigned to? Looking at our Inventory tab in View Administrator, we can see that Charles has been assigned to Agents01. You can also see that there's a persistent disks section that has appeared within this pool. Agents02 has a persistent disk, but no user has been assigned to it yet. By selecting Charles's desktop, we're able to detach his persistent disk. We can choose whether to put the persistent disk on the current data store or explicitly define a specific data store. Let's define an explicit one. And we'll select our NFS. Selecting the root, we'll click OK, and then click OK again. Notice the status goes to archiving. After waiting a little while and clicking refresh, we can see that his persistent disk is no longer there. So it's been successfully detached from his desktop. Now you can see that Agents01 no longer exists. The virtual machine is actually deleted after the persistent disk is detached. But now Charles has no desktop to log into, and if he did, and connected to a brand new Agents machine, all of his data would have been gone from his perspective. By coming down to the persistent disk section over in the left navigation, and clicking on the Detach tab, we can now see Charles's Agent01 persistent disk, including the time that it was detached. We also have the option to import a persistent disk from vCenter. By deleting this disk, we can remove it from View Manager or delete it altogether. By deleting it from just View Manager gives us the ability to later import it into vCenter. With this persistent disk, we can choose to attach it to an existing desktop. We can edit the persistent disk to put it into a different linked clone pool, and potentially attach it to a different user. This could be useful when you need to use the persistent disk as a forensic tool. We can also choose to recreate the desktop that Charles last had. This desktop that we recreate will automatically go into the same pool in which it originally existed, and will automatically assign that user to that desktop. So let's go ahead and do that. Switching over to our Attach tab, we can see that Charles's persistent disk is now attached to a desktop, but that desktop hasn't been defined or created yet. Clicking refresh, we can see that it's now been assigned a desktop, specifically Agents03. By clicking on Agents03, it'll take us directly to that desktop, where we can see that it's currently provisioning. We can also see that it has a persistent disk attached to it. Let's switch back to our pool view and look in the Inventory tab. Now if we look at the data stores that Agent03 desktop exists on, we can see it's on both the iSCSI data store, which will be the linked clone disk, and the NFS data store, which is where the persistent disk lives in. Now that Charles's desktop has been provisioned, let's go have him log in with the View client. Now logged in as Charles, we can see that our email and our background are the way that we left them. Taking a look at my computer, we'll see our persistent disk, with all of our settings already in place, including the one that allows us to see hidden files and folders. You can also see that we are on Agents03 desktop now. So that's how we can manage the user's profile by using the View Persistent Disk. Now let's take a look at the View Disposable Disk. This is a disk that View adds into a virtual machine in order to reduce the growth of the linked clone disk by redirecting temporary files so they can easily be removed. Here we are back on Charles's desktop, where we'll take a look at My Computer. Here you can see the local C drive and the persistent data disk that we were just taking a look at. Plus we have a system disposable disk. Looking at the system disposable disk, we can see we have a temp directory. If we go into our folder options, and unhide the protected operating system files, we'll see a few more items that are redirected to the disposable disk, including the page file and the system volume information. To demonstrate the persistency of this data, let's create a new file. If we simply do a log off, and then log right back in, we'll see that that file still exists, because View hasn't wiped out that disposable disk yet. I'll reopen My Computer and take a look in the disposable disk under the temp directory, and you can see New Wave Sound is still there. Now let's actually perform a shutdown to actually create a power cycle event. While that's rebooting, let's take a look at the configuration of this pool and where we can set up the disposable disk. So right below the persistent disk configuration, we can define the size of the disposable disk. Both the persistent and disposable disks can only be turned on or off during the creation of the pool. Once the pool is created, you cannot turn them off. But you can change the size and the drive letter that is used for the persistent disk. Now let's take a look at what the persistent disk looks like on the data store. The disposable disk is always stored on the same data store as the linked clone itself, which in our case is going to be on this iSCSI IX401. So let's browse that data store. And we'll look at Agents03, where we can see there's a VDM disposable disk of size 4 gig. Now this disk is thin provisioned, so it's not taking up a full 4 gig. Let's power this virtual machine back on. And then we can reconnect to the desktop. Now the VM is powered back up and we've logged in. So let's take a look at the disposable disk one more time. Now you can see that that WAV file that we created is now gone. Because when we shut down the VM, View deleted the disposable disk and created a new one in its place, thereby wiping out the change that we made. So that's the View disposable disk. So to wrap up, here are a few resources I recommend you research for more information. First of all, there's the View Persona Management Deployment Guide that runs you through the entire process of how to deploy View Persona Management. There's also the View 5 Administration Guide, which I always reference, and has some great information about the persistent and disposable disks. In this lesson, we covered the user profile and user data. We discussed the value of the user profile and how important it is to the end-user experience in a virtual desktop infrastructure, especially one where you're using floating pools. We went over some of the contents of the user profile and the different directories that make it up. Then we covered some of the options that you have for managing user profiles, such as Active Directory roaming profiles and the View User Persona Management. Then we dove in deep on the View Persona Management and gave a high-level overview of what it is, how to manage it, and the major settings that you have available. We then covered the persistent and disposable disks and how they can help manage your user profile and the size of your linked clones. The final thing we discussed was folder redirection and how you can use it to manage your user data and keep it outside of the profile. And then we wrapped up with some demonstrations of View Persona Management, the View Persistent disk, and the View Disposable disk. I hope this was a worthwhile lesson for you, and hopefully now you feel comfortable with managing your user profiles to make the most out of your View environment.